Um, Very good afternoon, good morning, and also good evening to you all. Welcome to T20 Task Force 1 session on strengthening multilateral trading system to support economic recovery and post-pandemic era. This is the session from T20 Task Force, which focus actually on the open trade, sustainable investment, and industry. And this session is organized by Center for Strategic and International Studies, Jakarta, as a co-host of T20 Indonesia. My name is Yose Rizal Damuri. I'm the Executive Director of CSIS and the Executive Co-Chair of the T20 Indonesia. I will be your moderator for our sessions this afternoon. When the pandemic started more than 2 years ago, we actually witnessed big disruptions on trade, supply chains, and productions. But it turned out that the disruption disappears more quickly. So even by the end of 2020, global trade has actually reached back to its pre-pandemic level. However, during the last 2 years, we also already witnessed there have been a big shift in the structure and characteristic of global trade. Trade in several types of goods and services plummeted, while trade in others increased significantly. Most notable is the booming of trade in digitally delivered services that has different characteristics from conventional trade. That would create different kind of challenge in managing global trade. This shift alone require more effective multilateral trading system, since the existing one that has been in place currently has been in place for more than 25 years, and we can say that the systems have been without considerable updating. Maintaining the open and independent global trading systems is actually necessary condition for economic recovery. So that any recovery will be short-lived without open international markets that are essential to prosperous to the world economy. So in light with this context, the objective of this panel, these sessions, is actually to discuss how the multilateral trading system can improve global value chain resilience in economic recovery and find a common framework for a meaningful and workable WTO reform agenda. Furthermore, the sessions will discuss also policy recommendations to support concrete deliverables on this MTS to the Indonesian G20 presidency, particularly on the Trade, Investment, and Industry Working Group. To start the sessions, please allow me to welcome our distinguished speakers, distinguished panelists, who are all policymakers, experts on international trade, which comes from various backgrounds. The first speaker that we have today is Bapak Jatmiko Wicaksono from he's the Director General of International Trade International Trade Negotiations, Ministry of Trade, Republic of Indonesia. Pak Jatmiko is also the co-chair of the G20 Trade, Investment, and Industry Working Group. The second speaker is the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organizations, Ms. Annabel Gonzalez. We are honored to have you in our discussions, Ms. Gonzalez. The third speaker, we have Ms. Hanan Morsi, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary from the United Nations of Economic Committee for Africa. Thank you for joining with us, Ms. Morsi. Our fourth panelist is Ms. Sinta Kamdani. She is the chair of B20 Indonesia. Good afternoon, Bu Sinta. And joining with us from Japan is Professor Fukunari Kimura, who is the Chief Economist of Economic Research Institute of ASEAN and East Asia. Thank you for joining us, Professor Kimura. And last but not least, from our own Task Force 1 co-chairs, Professor Andreas Freitag. He is a professor of economics at the Friedrich Schiller University of Jena. So we are very fortunate to have this line of a very distinguished speaker in our sessions. I would like to ask Pak Jatmiko first to talk about Indonesia's agenda, especially to share with us Indonesia's agenda, especially on strengthening multilateral trading systems, and also perhaps explaining to us how the agendas of trade, investment, and industry working group in this year's G20 presidency would also support that kind of the agenda in strengthening the multilateral trading systems. You have 5 minutes, Pak Jatmiko, to share with us.
Thank you, Pak Jose. Very good afternoon, very good morning, everyone. Happy to see you again. Probably some of you know me before, but I assume probably some of you, this is the first time for you to see me. Anyway, Pak Jose, thank you very much for inviting me on this very honorable discussion. It's very honorable for me to be part of this discussion. As you have mentioned, that Indonesia currently we hold as the presidency of the G20 in 2022. Of course, we, as the presidency, has set up the priorities. As our President Pak Jokowi has mentioned, there are three priorities for Indonesian presidency. First, supporting the global health architecture. Secondly, try to improve the digital transformations. And then the last one, the energy transition. Speaks on behalf of the Trade Investment Industry Working Group. Of course, we also have set up certain priority of issue or agenda that we will try to bring up into the discussion of the working groups. The priority agenda that we have established for this G20 presidency, there are 6 agenda of priorities. 4 priorities related to the trade issues, and 1 priority related to the investment, and 1, last but not least, at this presidency, we also try to, grasp the aspect of industry, because we believe that trade, industry, and investment as a triple helix for the economic recovery. So not only trade and investment as the, regular issue that have been discussed along the G20 presidency over the past few years, but we also would like to enhance the discussion of the groups, touching upon also the industry aspect. So from the perspective of trade, we have 4 main agenda. The first one, this is the legacy issue on WTO reform. because I think at this point in time, WTO still facing the challenge on this particular issue, how the WTO can be, in more responsive to the dynamics that now happen, including during the pandemic. Over the past 2 years, we have facing the issue on addressing the vaccine productions, distributions, and to ensure that all WTO members have the equitable access to that particular issues. And then as well as on the other areas like fishery subsidies, agriculture negotiation is also another important area that we need to address. So, Pak Jose, this WTO reform will be the first agenda issue that we need to tackle with in this working group. However, we are going to address this in the second meeting of the TILWG in June, not this week, because this week will be the first kickoff meeting for the TILWG. The other priority issue of the TILWG priority issue is the role of multilateral trading system in supporting the achievement of sustainable development goals. We are very aware with the status of how most of the country in this world are agreed to achieve the SDG by 2013. And we acknowledge that 17 goals with 169 targets and 200 more as indicator is something need to be achieved by everyone, including WTO. So we believe that WTO can play a very important role to support that the targets. In spite of we have only one specific mandate from the SDG to address on the, I think, goals number 14.6 on eliminating the overfishing and subsidies. But we believe actually WTO can still have more rooms to make an action in order to support the achievement of the SDG. The number 3 of the agenda issue is on how trade, investment, and industry can respond to the pandemic, as well as to support the global health architecture, as what our president has mentioned as part of our 3 priorities of our presidency. So in this context, we believe that the collaboration between the policy of trade as well as the activities on investment and how the ecosystem of industry can go together in supporting or ensuring that the equitability for the access of vaccines, this medicine and therapeutic is happen. So that's the number 3. And number 4 of the issue is on digital trade and global value chains. In this context, of course, we believe WTO also have a important position, important pivotal roles on ensuring that the digital transformation will, end up with the a balance of opportunity for everyone's, not winner takes all, but provide a large opportunity from a big business player until the small and medium enterprises, because this is something that the many of the countries still, including Indonesia, we still we're still facing a very rapid development on the digitalization. However, in terms of the policy aspect, I think there's still a challenge because we don't want to somehow to undermine the potentiality of digital economy. But in the other hand, of course, we need to have the consciousness that you need to be ensured that the digitalization will not lead to non-meaningful outcome, especially for the small group of the element of the community, especially for the SME. So I think that's the main priority for Indonesian presidency, Pak Jose, especially for the TILWG. We have another two on industry and investment, but probably later on I can inform.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Jatmiko. Thank you for sharing with us the priorities agenda of the Trade, Investment and Industry Working Group of the G20 2022, and also for explaining to us how all those priority agendas actually are related to the multilateral trading systems. And talking about multilateral trading systems, of course, we cannot escape from the role of the WTO. So we are very fortunate of having Ms. Annabel Gonzalez here in our forum. So Ms. Gonzalez, how did you see the G20 support actually can be materialized in strengthening the multilateral trading systems, especially in this post-COVID-19 recovery? And more specifically, I also would like to hear from you that what roles can the G20 actually play to further advance the agenda of the WTO reforms that has been discussed around for quite a while, but never really take place and materialized. Please, Ms. Gonzalez, you have also 5 minutes to share with us your thought and opinion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jose, for this kind invitation. It is a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And let me maybe start by saying that given the unfolding tragedy in Ukraine, it is difficult to see right now how the G20 could come together in support of the global trading system. And yet, G20 leadership to strengthen the global trading system is needed more than ever, not just to safeguard the value of the rules-based trading system, but also to leverage that system to build a more resilient global economy. I see 3 concrete contributions that the G20 could make for more resilient trade. First, the G20 could give political backing for the adoption of a pandemic response package at the WTO. Trade has been remarkably resilient in the face of a one-in-a-century pandemic. Even as trade collapsed in the second quarter of 2020, global value chains for critical medical and food supplies kept running, helping save millions of lives. What's more, without trade, it is hard to see how the world could have produced and rolled out COVID-19 vaccines at the record speed and massive scale that it did. And yet, if trade had been subject to fewer obstacles, such as export restrictions, we could have done even better. That's part of the reason why we urgently need WTO members to finalize and adopt a WTO pandemic response package. We need to get the job done of vaccinating the world. We need to diversify global vaccine production, and we need to be much better prepared when the next pandemic strikes. A WTO pandemic response package with a compromise solution on the role of intellectual property rights in combating the pandemic would help us do all those things. and it could provide a template for a response by WTO members to other shocks. I'm thinking in particular of the crippling impact of the Ukraine conflict on global food markets and the need to respond with trade policies that help, not hinder, global food security by keeping global food markets open and food supply chains running. Second, the G20 could give political direction on a unified WTO approach to the critical issue of supply chain resilience. Continued supply chain disruptions have reminded us once again how interconnected the global economy really is. A shortage of workers in California's warehousing or trucking industries, for example, can interrupt factory operations halfway around the world. But this is no case for a retreat from trade, which helps us to adapt to shocks. Even purely domestic supply chains can be disrupted by natural or man-made disasters. And even the largest, most technologically advanced countries rely on access to a vast and complex array of global inputs that cannot be supplied domestically. So what we need is more, not less trade. What we need is diversification, not decoupling. One obvious step in that direction would be to accelerate the implementation of the WTO's Trade Facilitation Agreement, which offers powerful tools to expedite trade and lower costs. And it is also past time to agree on global rules on digital trade, which could help us move forward paperless trade, facilitate real-time data sharing between supply chain actors, and put in place other key building blocks of resilient supply chains. Global rules on digital trade would open new trade opportunities for new players, above all small businesses, which are disproportionately affected by red tape at the border and for whom electronic commerce is a springboard to overcome the initial cost of participating in global value chains. And we should not forget about the need to modernize the infrastructure that holds every link of the supply chain together and which has suffered from decades of underinvestment in many parts of the world. And my third and last point is that there cannot be supply chain resilience without climate resilience. The consequences of climate change are already making themselves felt in the form of more extreme weather events and associated disasters, from hurricanes to droughts to floods to wildfires, all of which are putting some of our key trade infrastructure at risk. The G20 could send a strong political signal about the importance of using every tool in the WTO toolbox to support climate change adaptation and mitigation. For example, lowering trade barriers to environmental goods and services would further reduce the cost of renewable energy and lower the capital cost of building climate resilient infrastructure, particularly in developing countries. The WTO also has a role to play in supporting coordinated efforts to reduce fossil fuels and other subsidies that harm our environment and drain public finances. And the trade cooperation at the WTO could go a long way to avoid that border carbon adjustments and other climate measures lead to trade fragmentation and uncertainty, which would ultimately undermine green investment. So a unified message coming from the G20 in these three areas could make a big difference in my view, not just to help advance the three priority issues identified by the Indonesia presidency: global health, digital transformation, and the sustainable energy transition. It would also help keep a lid on power-based trade relations to prevent that they overwhelm the rules-based trading system. Let me stop here and thank you very much again, Jose.
Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you for a very clear message that G20 can take up to provide all those political support, especially on the pandemic response package of WTO, supply chain resilience, and one. I think the last one's also very important on climate resilience. I think that really connects to what the aspects that I like the next speaker I'd like to ask to the next speakers, especially to Ms. Hanan Mursi, on the how this multilateral trading systems actually can also provide assistance or provide support to developing and less developed countries. There are basically are in vulnerable positions due to the pandemic, especially when we're talking about export restrictions to the protective equipment or medical equipment and pharmaceuticals products, like what we already witnessed so far during the last 2 years. Ms. Hanan Mursi, can you share your thought in 5 minutes, please?
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to start by really commending the Indonesian presidency for bringing the issues of trade, investment, and industry under one working group. It's the first time that this is done this way, and it has been really the way that the approach that the Economic Commission for Africa has been advocating for. And the areas that are covered under this task force really could not be more critical to Africa's development than as of today. As we have seen, the pandemic have already had tremendous impact on health, economic implications, and most importantly, exacerbating inequality. And this brings really to the forefront the role and the importance of having a multilateral trading system that is fair, equitable, and leaves no country behind. And in that sense, it's particularly important that issues related to developing countries are well captured. There are a number of issues in the current multilateral trade system that are not really working for developing countries and African countries. And these have to do with one, issues like highly trade distorting agricultural subsidies that basically hits a sector where Africa has a comparative advantage, but at the same time, how these subsidies are currently designed put the continent at a disadvantage. And this became even more critical with what we are seeing now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and its implication on food security, particularly for African countries. So tackling this will be key. Another area is, of course, what has been already referred to by other colleagues in terms of the implications of intellectual property rights on common goods, like vaccines, treatments for epidemic diseases, and how we can make this really work, particularly during time of crisis, because this have massive implications, and we've seen that impact through access to HIV and AIDS drugs and through the COVID-19 vaccines. Third, and this is a really critical issue, is the issue that there has been little benefit in the form of preferential market access through the application of special and differential treatment. And this has been because of the lack of a clear rule-based way of applying it and leaving it to self-designation. So tackling this issue would really be key going forward. So the areas where I think we can define, like in terms of the problems, would say probably like three areas of deficits. One is the issue of development deficit, that the reform to the multilateral trading system need to incorporate at the heart development issues so that no countries are left behind. Second is the issue of rule-based deficit, and we don't want to have we want a rule-based system, not a power-based system. so that rules are clear, easy to apply, and fair and equitable to everyone. And currently, the system that is there, particularly also for the dispute settlement system, tends to be too expensive for many developing countries to invoke and too impractical to put to use. So this will need to be as well tackled. And of course, all this really also brings another issue of legitimacy, which is the legitimacy deficit. For a system to be legitimate, it has to have the buy-in for it to be global, it has to have the buy-in globally, not just by developed countries, but by all country groups. So it's really important to have the reforms that make it more inclusive going forward. And I believe that really the T20 will be under the Indonesian presidency would be well positioned to make change and reforms in that direction. And I think one of the areas where we need to see more of is all the work and the statements and communiques by the G20 going beyond just being communiques, but going to basically be reflected in their advocation for reforms as member states in the WTO. So beyond actions, beyond just words will be key. I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to give more specifics later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morsi. Thank you also for reminding us and also to give strong message, especially to Pak Jatmiko here as a representative of G20 Indonesia, that we also need strong actions, not just beyond communique and beyond statements on all those issues that we already face so far. Let me shift to our attentions to the business sectors. We have Ibu Sinta Kamdani here from B20. Bu Sinta Kamdani, perhaps you can share with us business perspective, especially on the global value chain resilience. And how do you see the importance of global value chain resilience during this pandemic era? Also, perhaps we can share with us the G20 rules or G20 rules on disciplining trade, investment, and industry. Please, Bu Sinta, perhaps you can share with us your thought in 5 minutes.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you for this opportunity to share the business perspectives. Yes, we are the B20, the disengagement group, and as what mentioned before, our outcome is not just merely policy recommendation, but obviously also concrete actions, and that can also be the legacy of Indonesia presidencies. So I wanted to start by how the COVID-19 pandemic have challenged also, I think, the multilateral trading system, especially in the WTO effectiveness. I think adding the impacts of the health crisis to the international trade system, the role of the WTO as the center of the multilateral trading system has been greatly undermined by the unilateral action taken by countries. So despite the broadly shared appetite to reform the WTO, numerous efforts to do so are still handicapped by the diverging perception on how WTO should be reformed and the impasse of the WTO member-driven decision-making process. And the COVID-19 pandemic did not stop the systemic problems of WTO. And I think in the middle of the 2020 during the pandemic, even we've seen that WTO also has to cancel its ministerial meeting. I just want to start with that because the importance, how we've been talking a lot about WTO reform. And obviously, the pandemic has impacted the global supply chain, and we have seen that, of course, the many decline in terms of the restriction of mobilization, has definitely impacted as well in the logistic aspect and so forth. But I wanted to perhaps share a little bit of what we are doing, especially in the B20 related to this. And I think in the B20, we aims to provide recommendation that required policy changes and also to execute private sector-led transformation that will enable the G20 economies to recover and to be more resilient, more inclusive and more sustainable in embracing the new normal. However, beyond providing this, I think we also, as I mentioned, aim to provide the knowledge sharing opportunity, the networking across country, and create impactful, tangible, and lasting legacy. In the B20 Indonesia, we have a specific task force on trade and investment, which is collating with the government working group of trade, investment, and industry. And through this task force, we actually seek to facilitate a dialogue to implement an open, fair, and efficient post-pandemic global trade and investment regime after the pandemic. And the key agenda is to push for more innovative, inclusive, and sustainable global supply chain. Some topics are going to be the main highlight of this task force, such as the promotion of course, the non-discriminatory principle in trade, WTO reform, strategic use of science, innovation, technology, and digitalization for global development, and also mitigation of future crises, the increase of trade liberalization in environmental goods and services to support SDG, sustainable investment for green transition, and the inclusion of SMEs to the post-pandemic global supply chain. And I want to highlight specifically this, the inclusion of SME, because in the past, I think there's not much talk in the B20 about SME, and this is for emerging economies. I think this is also important to bring forward the impact of SMEs and how we can recover stronger with the SME part of the global supply chain. So we focus on 4 recommendations. This is still currently under develop. So the first is to promote open, fair, inclusive, and efficient post-pandemic global trade and investment regime. We push the G20 countries to roll back pandemic and non-pandemic trade restrictive measures and subsidies inconsistent with the WTO rules and refrain from implementing new ones. There is also a need for G20 member states to also support measures towards an inclusive, equitable, and balanced economic recovery, recognizing different development levels between nations and within nations. So we've seen this pandemic impacted a great disparity. And I've stated earlier that G20 government must emphasize, I think, the effort to strengthen multilateral cooperation and modernize the multilateral trading system through initiating a continuous reform of the WTO to support the SDG. The second recommendation is to facilitate innovation, digitization, and technology adoption to support international development and mitigation of future global crises. I think G20 countries must create global governance to facilitate safe and free cross-border data flows and foster conformity in digital trade, and also to promote further exchanges and strategic use and sharing of science, technology, and data for crisis detection, creating global coordination framework for future crisis mitigation. The outcome of the G20 summit this year must be relevant to future shock, not only to mitigate the current ones. The third recommendation is to amplify support to attain inclusivity in global supply and value chain. And we are promoting the increased access to finance and create a regulatory environment that enable investors and lending institutions to support female entrepreneurs and MSME to trade and scale up business, and also promote further inclusion of MSME and female-led businesses in the domestic, regional, and global supply chain through inclusive ecosystem models. I think global economic growth must be inclusive, including to all these female-led and SMEs.
Bu Sinta,
And
we
the
have to.
last recommendation is to make trade and investment impactful drivers for a greener and more sustainable development in line with the SDG. This year, I think Indonesia has a strategic chance to lead the global energy transition efforts, and it is clearly manifested from President Jokowi's G20 vision and generated to almost all relevant working and engagement group, including to B20. So we understand that energy transition is not an easy and short process, yet it has to be conducted in a just and orderly manner. So B20 Indonesia is currently developing a policy recommendation to mitigate financial impact and address loss of livelihood of energy transition. We push also the government to also facilitate cooperation and cross-border carbon trade and so forth. That's the end. I just want to share with you some of our recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bu Sinta, for a recommendation. Unfortunately, we don't really have much time in these sessions, but we do still have two other speakers. Professor Kimura, would you like to share your thought and perhaps also your observation so far about the global value chain and the rules of multilateral trading systems during this pandemic and beyond after the pre-pandemic recovery, post-pandemic recovery?
Thank you, Jose. I know that the time is limited, so I'd like to make 3 points very quickly. The first, due to COVID-19 and also geopolitical tensions, many developed countries are looking inward a lot. So from the viewpoint of newly developed economies and developing countries, G20 should advocate active trade and investment, as well as utilizing globalizing forces for economic development. I think that's a very, very important message that the G20 should present. If we look at the international production networks in East Asia, particularly manufacturing, particularly machinery industries, actually networks are not robust, actually the networks are really robust and resilient at the end. Then using, actually that was working like built-in stabilizer function over there. So I think still manufacturing links are very important for development. And also, as Yose talked about, trade in digitalizing services, those are picking up due to COVID-19. So we really have to utilize globalization forces for economic development. That's, in order to do that, the rule-based trading regime backed up by WTO is extremely important. So we have to emphasize that. That's the first point. Second, now we observe a proliferation of export control, managed trade, and everything due to various kinds of geopolitical tension and also political factors. A trade policy cannot really stop everything for politics, but at least those kind of measures should be consistent with a WTO policy discipline. So those should be should conform to that Article 20 and 21 and limit the scope of those kind of policies clearly. I think that's another thing that we really have to pause. The third point, WTO reform. 3 years ago, I was co-chair of trade and investment in T20 2019 Japan. We posed two areas of WTO reform. Actually, still those are important. One is revive dispute settlement system. Some countries are blocking that. We have to push for that. Second, reactivate WTO as a negotiating forum. We had some advancement recently, joint statement initiatives, including domestic regulation on services and e-commerce. having some progress. I know that some G20 members are not very positive about the approach of JSI, but I think we have to do everything to revive WTO. So I hope that G20 would emphasize those two areas in WTO reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kimura, for very brief but also very clear message to the WTO and also the G20. Last but not least, our dear friend Andreas would also share his thought about this issue, multilateral trading systems, and as an expert who has been following the issue of WTO and G20, I hope you can also provide us with some insight, Andreas, especially regarding the WTO reform. We've seen here there are several questions actually addressed on the WTO reforms. Please, Andreas.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be part of this very interesting panel. My main problem is that everything sensible has been said. So what I want to do is I want to summarize it and wrap it up and suggest a very important role for the G20, namely that the G20 can first play a role as an example, as an image. The G20 is responsible for more than 3/4 of world trade. So I think what G20 does itself is enormously important for the rest of the world. A second point I would like to make is that the G20 should start to change the perspective in the sense that they should again come to the conclusion that trade policy first and foremost hits the country that is applying trade policy. It is a means to prevent certain imports or certain exports, so it protects certain interest groups, but it doesn't help the whole economy and the whole society. It mostly hurts the poorest, by the way. Our trade policy hurts our poorest citizens. And therefore, I suggest that the G20 starts to change the perspective, look at the trade policy measures also with respect to the domestic effects, and then tries to get rid of this sort of prisoner's dilemma in which the G20 is moving with all these trade barriers which have been laid out in the last hour very clearly. In the last T20 round in Italy, we wrote a piece on subsidies, and we could indicate that there are a few tools to measure subsidies from the domestic perspective. And the idea is that tools like that could help the G20 to identify problems which hurt the countries that apply trade policy most, and thereby get rid of this sort of prisoner's dilemma and mutually agree on a more open and resilient trade regime. This is the second point I want to make. I think the third point I wanted to make is that developing countries should be seriously considered, but I think this has been done already in this panel. And the fourth point I would like to make is, and then the third here, is that the G20 should start to think comprehensively, because Annabelle made the point with the same argument, we can also add global geopolitics, and we could add development. So we should think comprehensively in the sense that trade policy is part of a policy package which is consisting of much more than trade barriers and thinking about individual reform steps, but it's a comprehensive problem, and we have seen how difficult it is to disentangle these different policy fields. Annabelle mentioned the crisis in Europe at the moment and the war, and so we should really think in broader terms. That's the point I want to make, and I think I stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Andreas. And we don't really have much time, because the organizers already remind me that the sessions will end in 1 minute actually. So well, it is very challenging for me actually to lead these discussions, especially because the topic is very important and we don't really have much time. We only have 50 minutes to discuss about all of this. But during these 50 minutes, I think there are a lot of valuable comments and valuable insight that has been shared by all the panelists here, and perhaps it would also be a good recommendations for G20 Indonesia, especially in its process to focus and to promote the multilateral trading systems. As Pak Jatmiko also mentioned before, all the priority agendas in G20 Indonesia are very related to the stronger, more effective multilateral trading systems. So hopefully these sessions would be beneficial to the success of G20 Indonesia, especially on the working group of trade, investments, and industry. And we can come up not only with communique and statement, but also with concrete actions towards a stronger and more effective multilateral trading systems. With that, I conclude these sessions. I would like to say my appreciation again to all speakers, Professor Kimura, Andreas Freitag, Pak Jatmiko, Annabel Gonzalez, Hanan Mursi, and Ibu Sinta Kamdani. Please, in T20 we do have several many other discussions and platforms. So your participations would be welcomed in those platforms. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Have a nice evening. Have a nice morning and afternoon as well.